Okay, it's now 5:31, so I do want to kind of start promptly so we have enough time to discuss the relevant issues in this roundtable and also give people a break before that annual lecture. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, first of all. My name is Dr. Danyel Fitzpatrick. I'm a lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University, and I'm also co-convener of the Political Studies, Sport and Politics Specialist Group. Given this year's PSA annual lecture is on the topic of sport and politics, we thought it would be remiss not to provide an opportunity for some more discussion and debate on one of the hot political topics of the moment, the 2022 Qatar World Cup, dubbed by some as the most controversial sports event in history. And Qatar 2022 is a World Cup of firsts, the first to be held in the Middle East, the first to have such a long lead-up time of over a decade, having been awarded in 2010, the first Winter World Cup, in inverted commas, for the Northern Hemisphere, and the smallest state ever to host the tournament if we are classifying smallness on the basis of population. Also, while the 2022 World Cup is by no means the first to arouse political controversy, perhaps the level of politicisation of this tournament is unprecedented. Is that scrutiny and criticism warranted, unwarranted, or welcome or unwelcome? To help us cut through some of this political mudslinging, I'm delighted to welcome our panel of esteemed speakers this evening. Not only do they bring intellectual and professional expertise to bear on this debate, but they also have experience of living and working in and with Qatar. So first to speak is Ambassador Susan Ziadeh. Have I pronounced that correctly, Susan?
Ziadeh, yes.
Ziadeh, thank you. And Susan is the former US ambassador to the state of Qatar. Additionally, she held senior diplomatic leadership positions in Riyadh, Baghdad, Bahrain, and Kuwait. She most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula Affairs. And having earned a PhD in Middle East history from the University of Michigan, she is now an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Following Susan will be Dr. Paul Brannagan. Paul is a senior lecturer in sport management and policy at Manchester Metropolitan University. Paul is an expert on the politics of sport in the Middle East, having completed his PhD on the topic, using Qatar as a case study in 2018 and subsequently publishing on the basis of that research. And Paul recently co-authored a book entitled Qatar and the 2022 FIFA World Cup, Politics, Controversy and Change, published by Palgrave this year, with our third speaker, Dr. Danyel Reiche. Danyel is a visiting research fellow at the Centre for International and Regional Studies and a visiting associate professor at Georgetown University, Qatar, where he leads a research initiative on the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Daniel's past research is focused on two areas, energy and sports policy and politics, and he is also a kind of specialist in those subjects in the region of the Middle East. So the format of the webinar today will be that each panelist will give a short talk, short as 5 to 10 minutes, on the topic of the World Cup in 2022 and whether it represents a case of soft power or sports washing or something in between. And then we'll open the floor to questions, and we would like this session to be as interactive as possible, so please do get involved. There will be an opportunity to ask questions over the microphone or via the chat. Okay, so Susan, over to you. Would you like to begin?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel with our esteemed colleagues. Can everybody hear me? Is it clear? Yeah. Okay, excellent. Well, I really wanted to talk a little bit about the geopolitics of Qatar, the background of soft power and how it evolved, to give it a good historical context. I'm a historian by training, that's how I think. and to look at the development of Qatar over the last 25 years broadly and what it has meant in terms of the development of the soft power component. Qatar, as you know, is a small state. It's not just a population of about 3 million. Its native inhabitants, maybe about 300,000. It's a small state, doesn't have a large population, as I said, but also in terms of size. And so the idea is, how do you protect a small state? How do people know about where a small state is, what it looks like, what it's all about? And part of soft power and the thinking behind the father Emir, the previous Emir, when he took over in 1995, was how do you secure the country and pursue visibility and build a profile for this country internationally, to link it to the profile of an international fabric, which would then protect it globally. How does it project power? How does it project influence? And so the soft power was a huge component of how to create linkages worldwide to secure Qatar as a global entity. So we see this under the father Emir beginning in the 1990s, and there were several components that contributed this. First of all, and most important, was the development of liquefied natural gas. This started in the 1990s with a lot of investment, not only from Qatar, but from foreign companies, and in particularly ExxonMobil, the US company. How they created an economic platform providing LNG to countries around the world, and how they developed relations with foreign countries by having them invest in LNG in Qatar, and how LNG was provided for countries in the US, in Europe, and in Asia in ways to create important trade and economic linkages. That's one. Number two, the launch of Al Jazeera, which is the first satellite network in the Middle East, and how it strengthens Qatar's soft power and messaging. Now, that even has gone through different phases with different countries happy with Al Jazeera and unhappy with Al Jazeera. But Al Jazeera remains an important platform, not only for Qatar, but for gauging Arab public opinion throughout the region. So that's number two. Three, when Qatar opened up El Udeid Air Base in 2002, to the US Air Force, and you started to have an American military presence, which is very large, over 10,000 service people there in Qatar, providing an important component not only to the US military, but for regional security and anti-ISIS and anti-counterterrorism operations, among others. And the fact that even in El Udeid, you have coalitions of military from different countries around the world that are participating in El Udeid and living in Qatar. You have the dramatic growth of Qatar Airways, which has created linkages across the world, from the global south to the far north, in terms of trade, movement of peoples. Sometimes it's a matter of people traveling via Qatar to other destinations, but the fact is that Qatar Airways has been an important branding element for Qatar. Qatar has taken on mediation efforts in political disputes. You see it in the Horn of Africa, where they've been playing a role. You see it in their relations with Hamas. We, as the US, had asked Qatar to help us in terms of interaction with the Taliban as early as 2011. I was involved in some of that when I was ambassador in Qatar, and know the importance that played and continues to play. And of course, the hosting of Education City, the universities in Qatar, where they have hosted 6 US universities, but also British, French, Canadian, among others. And the fact that they are educating people from around the whole region in Qatar, and then sending them out to work in areas with hopefully a positive experience in Qatar. I mean, the list goes on and on. But sports for the last 15 years has been a very important part. It's really been central to Qatar's branding. Now, this started before the awarding of the World Cup. The Qataris have understood that sports is a great way to create linkages with countries around the world and give profile to Qatar. You saw this in the hosting of the Asian Games in 2006, where Qatar got good accolades for a successful hosting of those games. You see it as they develop institutions within their own country, like the development of the Aspire Academy beginning in 2004, where they start to train Qatari athletes and other athletes in a number of different sports, but in particularly in football, or what we in America term soccer. And then the Aspire Zone Foundation in 2008, which served as a broader platform. There was the creation of greater public spaces for residents in Qatar, more emphasis on sports and linkages with other institutions in the training and development of athletes. And of course, the constructions throughout Qatar for green spaces that promoted an environment for sports and healthy living, which has continued till today. So this is all part of their soft power initiative, how to protect themselves, how to place themselves geographically on the map. And the World Cup certainly was a very, very important part of that strategy that has paid off, I think, and there have been questions about it, and I know this will be part of the discussion, but certainly for many people, I do want to say this first and foremost, you know, for many people, not just in Qatar, in the Arab world and in the global South, the fact that these games were played in an Arab, a Muslim, and an Asian country with ties, tremendous ties to the global South has been a big source of pride to many, many peoples. And I think, frankly, that point is a bit missed if you just read the Western media in understanding the World Cup. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's really kind of useful to get some historical context, and I think it's also kind of really important when we're thinking from a kind of primarily a sports perspective that this is obviously the World Cup, you know, despite its prominence, is part of a broader strategy. And you know, and you mentioned Al Jazeera, it might not even be the most important part of it, but I think kind of seeing it in that broader context, both the strategic and historical context, is really, really useful. So thank you for that. Paul, could we move on to you if you're ready?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. First of all, what a privilege to be here with such illustrious speakers, and I'm pleased to say that our findings align quite well, pretty much exactly with what Susan has just said there. So that's a really, really good start. And certainly thank you to your good self, Danny, as well, for organising this. You mentioned, Danny, our book, which has recently come out. It came out, I think, in March of this year, so it's pretty fresh, I guess. And within that book, what we really do is we look at Qatar's objectives behind hosting and trying to acquire the World Cup. And echoing what Susan said there, I think the sort of three key areas Daniel and I identify as well. You know, why would such a small country want to host such a massive tournament? And we said the three things: overcome their invisibility, emerge certainly from the shadow, foreign policy shadow of Saudi Arabia, its much larger neighbor, to gain influence in its own right, and to expand its influence beyond its size in small state terms, and finally to shore up its national security. I think rather than just going over what Qatar looked to achieve, I think what Daniel and I have been tried to do at least is flip this discussion a little bit on its head. So rather than looking at what the World Cup tells us about Qatar, what does the example of Qatar tell us about global sport? And there's really a number of things there in soft power terms. The first is that there is this idea amongst policy leaders and state leaders that hosting sports mega events are good things, and particularly when it comes to acquiring power. Now, one might understand that as well. if you're a state leader, one of the first things that one needs to do if you're going to wield soft power is introduce yourself to international audiences. And of course, one of the best ways to do that might well be to host the Summer Olympic Games or a Football World Cup, where the audiences are in their billions. And I think certainly Qatar has looked to do that. And, you could argue, certainly, I think as Susan was alluding to there, if you're looking to overcome your invisibility, the World Cup is a fantastic soft power resource, most certainly. But I think it also teaches us a little bit about, do these sports events actually bring about soft power? So soft power, as Nye defines it, is the ability to get what you want through being simply attractive. Then what we have to really ask is, well, do these events actually paint a positive or attractive image of their host around the world? And actually, a lot of times we see is both, the answer to that is both yes, but also inherently no. There's never been a sports mega event that hasn't come with some sort of controversy. And I think this really alludes, again, not just to the way that power works in sport, but also the way power works more generally on the international stage and the international relations. So while states will look to host major events that attract global audiences to improve their image, this also provides other states and other actors an equally blessed opportunity to improve their own soft power. So we take organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, or even certain, if you like, Western media like the Guardian, the New York Times, etc. The World Cup has also provided them with a great opportunity to improve their own soft power, but by doing so, by discrediting Qatar's messages and Qatar's soft power. So one of the concepts I coined with a colleague of mine, Rich Giulianotti, was this idea of soft disempowerment. And this really feeds into the idea that we need to remember that if you're going to use major events like a World Cup to gain attractiveness and soft power, there's always going to be risks. And a lot of the times, the risks can potentially outweigh the benefits. So there's a real great deal of irony here. If you're a state who's looking to gain soft power, you can actually end up becoming disempowered a lot more than you can become empowered in attractive terms. So we take a country like Qatar, look to use the World Cup very much to improve its image, to place itself firmly on the global map, to attract international audiences in terms of trade, tourism, diplomacy, cultural relations. But actually, a lot of people, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, have actually been introduced to Qatar in the opposite terms. They now know Qatar and associate Qatar with issues to do with human rights, accusations of bribery and corruption, but also, certain issues around even silly things like the weather, for example. So what this really reminds us of, and this is certainly not an attack on Qatar, this is more an honest critical evaluation of sports events, that countries who look to use these events to paint a positive image of themselves need to be very, very careful, because by opening themselves up, they also encourage others, such as the global media and various international non-governmental organizations, to search and investigate these countries' issues in a much stronger way than they would have done. So if we take a good example here is, look at the UAE, Qatar's neighbor, for example, recently hosted the World Expo, arguably one of the largest non-sporting events we have. But the coverage of that event in terms of Dubai's issues with human rights or the UAE's issue with human rights have been nowhere near to the level that we've seen when it comes to the World Cup. So I guess the point of my message here is that Qatar, yes, as you mentioned, Danny, has certainly been the most controversial sports event ever, I think we can say. But that's, important to remember there is that all of these sports events bring a great deal of controversy with them. So if you're looking to use them, if you're a state leader looking to use them to gain soft power, you need to be very, very much aware of the risks as well and the potential soft disempowerment that can also follow. I'll leave it there, if that's all right.
Thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, some kind of interesting kind of questions to ponder in terms of that balance of risk and reward, and kind of thinking how that might be different for a state like Qatar compared to other more larger, more established states on kind of the international level, let's say. But yeah, so some things, I can see there's some questions already coming in. But to kind of wrap up the contributions, Daniel, you're going to kind of finish with some kind of, do you want to kind of finish some kind of concluding remarks on what Paul and Susan have already said?
Yeah, I think Susan and Paul have summarized very well the scholarship on Qatar and the objectives of Qatar to invest in sport and how it's related to the academic literature on small states and overcoming invisibility, gaining influence, contributing to national security. So I will just make a couple of remarks on the event itself. Paul and I wrote in the last chapter of our book titled Qatar in 2020 and Beyond Changes, Opportunities and Challenges that delivering a successful World Cup would be key for Qatar's future reputation. And I think that one can say that Qatar concluded a successful World Cup. I attended myself 13 matches and everything was very well organized. I have to admit I had a bit concerns prior to the event about logistics, but I went to most matches by public transportation. It worked very well. The entrance to the stadium was smooth. So, and the stadiums were full. So it was in the first 48 matches more attendance in the stadiums than in Russia after the same number of matches. And also the TV viewerships that were reported were pretty good, not in my country, Germany, but for example, in the US, there was a new record for men's national teams match on TV. The match USA against England had a record viewership on Fox. So there were, Macron just came for the French match, and Secretary Blinken was there. So there was not like a diplomatic boycott then, like at other previous mega sporting events in non-democratic countries. So overall, I would say, yes, Qatar delivered a successful World Cup. And I also would be a bit careful in labeling this as the most controversial sporting event ever. I mean, this is a Western perspective. This is something that might apply to some British newspapers and some German newspapers and some Scandinavian newspapers. But this critical discourse that we could witness in those countries was totally absent in the global South. So there is not one African country and there's not one Asian country where this critical discourse happened. And even in the two countries in Asia that do not belong to the global South, according to the most common definitions, Japan and South Korea, there was not such a critical debate. Doha was full of South Americans. This was the World Cup of Arabs and South Americans. In South America, this critical discourse was mostly absent. And also, if one reads like the Washington Post, New York Times, yes, they had critical articles, but not in a way like we could read this like in some British newspapers, which kind of had a campaign against Qatar, I believe. So this is, I think, in vast parts of the world, the focus was on sports, and the view on Qatar might be a bit more positive than maybe in the UK or in Germany. And so we have a bit of a division, I believe, now in the world. So we have some countries where these critical debates are even dominating the reporting. So I watched the opening match in Qatar on German TV. And in the hour before the opening match, there were human rights experts in the studio. There was mainly discussion on human rights. There was no focus on sport. And but I think, again, it's a couple of countries where the discourse is like this. And now we have even Denmark said they want to consider to leave FIFA maybe. So, I mean, So I think we have here a polarization and division. We have like a couple of countries super critical, but I think critical discourses are good. But if I read something like Denmark wanting to leave FIFA, what's the benefit of that? Sport should have, help to build bridges and to bring all the people together, and we would lose all of this. Certainly, one of the main topics of this World Cup was the revitalization of Pan-Arabism. I'm sure the Emir would have been surprised if somebody would have told him 2 years ago that he would wear a Saudi scarf, which he did the day after Saudi won against Argentina. And so, as we know, there was a blockade, a sea, land, and air blockade on Qatar from June 2017 until January 2021. And I'm sure the World Cup helped to overcome this, and Qatar did not meet any of the 13 demands. So there was a Saudi scarf by the Emir, wearing by the Emir. There was the first visit of the UAE president to Qatar after the blockade. There were many Arab leaders, like the Algerian president, defending Qatar against Western criticism. And there were displays of solidarity with Palestine in the stadiums and even by the team of Morocco after they won against Spain. So the New York Times wrote that Palestine became the 33rd World Cup team. And this is certainly something I can confirm as somebody being in lots of matches or fan zones. One saw the Palestinian flags all over. So, but the question, of course, is, will this pan-Arab solidarity last? And I mean, there were lots of tensions in the past, the blockade on Qatar. There are different views on the relationship to Israel. Some countries, such as Morocco, normalized relations with Israel. Others didn't. There are the wars in Yemen and Syria. So I think this is one of the interesting questions for the future. Will this have like a lasting effect? And so Qatar will continue hosting international sporting events. So the World Cup is not an end of a process. So just last week they announced the 2025 Table Tennis World Championship in Qatar, the 2024 Swimming World Championship in Doha. Next year, the Asian Football Championship relocated from China to Doha. 2030, the Asian Games. So there will be plenty of sporting events in the years to come in Qatar. But I think in the spirit of this pan-Arabism, it will be interesting to see whether sport will remain mainly a tool of distinction within the Gulf and the Arab world. And we can see globally now a new trend of co-hosting. We have the 2026 World Cup in the US and Mexico and Canada. We have next year the Basketball World Championship in Indonesia, Philippines, and Japan. Next year, the Women's FIFA World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. And I think this is a story that still needs to be written, that sport serves as a tool for cooperation in the Arab world and specifically in the Gulf. I leave it with this for now.
Thank you, Daniel. Good to kind of end on an upbeat note. So thank you to all our panelists. I've got lots of kind of questions I can ask off the back of that, but I would ask and invite people who've joined as participants to ask questions. We do have one in that's come in from Wendy. It's directed to Paul, but maybe it's something that all the panelists can consider. And Wendy asks, if the World Cup, in your opinion, if the World Cup has resulted in more soft power in a positive sense rather than controversy, kind of, I suppose at this point, kind of, we're not in the middle of the tournament, but still in the midst of the tournament, kind of on the, just before the final, kind of, what would be your assessment? And we'll go to you first of all, Paul, to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Wendy. Thanks for the question. So I think it's very difficult to answer that because the World Cup is still going on. Now, what I mean by that is we look at the way these events tend to happen. The pre-event stage tends to be where countries get the most scrutiny and controversy. During the tournament, the focus then becomes on the football and the country gets evaluated based on how well the tournament has been delivered, which, as far as I know, has been absolutely flawless on Qatar's part. So the after part, we still don't quite know. But it's difficult to be put on the spot in terms of, okay, has Qatar gained soft power, or has it been empowered more than it's been disempowered from this World Cup? Up to this point, I think, and leading on Daniel's point, it depends where you're sitting. I think in certain countries where there has been a lot more media scrutiny, perhaps not, whereas other countries where there's been less, then perhaps so. But until the event is over, and obviously the preceding months and years after the World Cup as well, it's going to be very difficult to know. I think it's going to take us a while before we're in a position to look back and say that was a resounding success or failure in soft power terms alone.
Thanks, Paul. Susan, would you like to respond to Wendy's question?
Well, I agree with Paul, but I also want to say maybe I have a slightly different take on it. When we look at media, again, much of what we in the West look at is Western media. So if we say that the media has been negative, that's true in the West, and it's been true in the sort of PR campaigns that have been mobilized in the West. And there have been critical comments, as Daniel has said, also in the United States. But that said, the largest contingent of fans who've gone to the World Cup are Americans. And that's a long way to go. And it's also a sport that Americans have been late to kind of latching onto as a national pastime. So I think it says something about the importance of sport. It also says something about curiosity about going to Qatar and watching the US team play and having that experience. For those who've been there, as both Paul and Daniel have said, the experience has been a positive one in terms of the actual mechanics and logistics and all of that. But of course, there will be issues that Americans raise as well as others about labor, about human rights, particularly gay rights, etc. Those issues are coming more and more to the fore also in the global South, and they will continue to be raised and addressed. But I still can't emphasize enough the great pride that people in the global South feel about the fact that this tournament was held in a country, in a region that hadn't held it before, and they've done a great job. It's not that it hasn't been held in the global South before. I realize in terms of places like Brazil and others, but all I'm saying is that people do have a lot of pride about the fact that it was held there successfully. The issues that have come to the fore will have to be addressed not only by Qatar, not only by other countries in the region that have similar issues, but around the world where there should be continued emphasis on how to make a more level playing field for all people who live in that country. And one thing I want to add, and perhaps this is something Daniel and Paul can address, is the fact that steps have been taken in Qatar. How they've been implemented and enforced is another issue in the sense that that's still a work in progress. But the fact that certain steps have been taken, I think, are important to note. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. And just a little note before we go to Daniel, David has kind of made the comment in the chat that kind of American fan supporters have been the largest contingent of support in the last 3 World Cups, he says, and even in Russia when the US didn't qualify, which is kind of interesting to think about kind of the dynamics of fandom of these kind of major global sporting events. Daniel, did you want to add anything to what Susan or Paul have said on Wendy's question?
Just very short, I concur that when we look at soft power, soft power always depends on not the sender, on the receiving end. And so I think certainly Qatar is considered as maybe champion of the global South now in many countries in the world, while in some Western countries there's a more critical approach. So it depends on where we look at. but also it's a continuous process. And I mean, Qatar has really changed a lot in the last 2.5 years. And of course, one could argue too late, because it was awarded the World Cup in 2010. The minimum wage, the dismantling of the kafala system, the extension of summer hours where outside work is not permitted, all of this just happened after 2020. So that's a valid criticism. It happened too late, but it happened, and Qatar is now a pioneer in the Gulf. And we should not forget that according to different estimations, there are 29 to 35 million migrant workers in the Gulf. And everybody's just so obsessed with Qatar, where less than 10% of them are. So it's now also an interesting question, will there be a diffusion of those reforms to other Gulf states? But it's also, of course, interesting to monitor what some human rights organizations have said. Was this all like for show because of the World Cup, or will it continue? I assume it will continue for a number of reasons, but of course it remains to see. And so will, for example, the minimum wage be increased? I think it should be, because of the high inflation we have all over the world. In Qatar, it's much lower than in my home country, but also in Qatar, it's higher than usually. So will we see this, for example? Will the government continue to do inspections on construction sites, whether rest days are accepted, whether working in the heat is not happening as it's prohibited by law? So all of this, of course, will be interesting to monitor in the years to come, but also whether other Gulf states, such as Saudi, who becomes now more and more active in international sports, will also improve the situation of its millions of migrant workers.
Yeah, so really interesting points there, Daniel. I think that point about kind of the assessment of soft power has to be according to the people receiving, on kind of the receiving end of it. And one thing that's kind of struck me while you've all been speaking is, I'm guilty of this as well, but as the West, let's say, in terms of the public discourse, the media discourse, I suppose we assume that we are the target audience of the soft power strategy, and maybe that assumption is false. Maybe we're not. Maybe there's the strategy is more regional, or it is the kind of the wider global South, and it's not primarily focused just on, let's say, kind of Western European or Western countries or liberal democratic countries. So I think that's it. That kind of differential take is kind of interesting when we think about what is the actual strategy. I'll ask a question. Kind of for other small states, and other small states which are maybe not as resource rich as Qatar, but perhaps have other resources that can be exploited. Is there anything to lose? Because Paul mentioned about that kind of soft power versus disempowerment, but is soft disempowerment better than invisibility? So I can see for a country like Brazil, soft disempowerment is a major risk because they have a certain reputation, particularly in sport, but they have other sources of soft power. Where a small state which is, let's say, kind of effectively invisible, what's this to lose? Is it always going to be worth the risk? What do we think? And I'll kind of open that out to anyone who wants to kind of jump in.
I mean, I can start if you like. That's a really great question. I think, I guess the difference is, I think what we need to define here is the difference between branding and soft power. So in terms of branding, soft disempowerment, can be quite good. And we actually see what we might call soft attempts at branding through sport, where a lot of states will go in and bid for mega events, knowing they're not going to win them. They're not going to be awarded them, but they get wrapped up and they get the limelight by simply putting their name forward, throwing their name into the ring, sort of thing. So that's also quite interesting. But I think that's branding. That's about raising awareness. Soft power isn't about raising awareness, albeit it's part of that. Soft power is about attracting. So it's much closer to public diplomacy than it is branding. So if we're judging it based on those core definitions, I would agree. I think for some states who have nothing to lose, it can only improve their branding strategy, i.e. our awareness of them. However, if it's about improving their image, then no, and actually turning that image into a positive, then I don't see how it can be beneficial, full stop, put it that way. But it's a really, really interesting idea. And I do think it is. And I think soft power has become really successful. And it's almost a victim of its own success in that we use the term soft power now to describe pretty much everything, when it's important to not do that and actually differentiate between the power side and simply the branding part. They're very different.
Thanks, Paul. Susan or Danny, would either of you like to kind of come in on that particular question? Okay, I would, if anyone else has got any questions in the kind of the wider participants, please do kind of raise your hand using the reactions button if you'd like to ask a question. My other kind of, David, yes, David Kilpatrick, go ahead if you want to put your microphone on, David.
Yeah, sure. Thank you all. Very, very, very interesting and really helpful to get these perspectives from the speakers. I'm wondering a little bit more about this idea of the idea of the negative effects of soft power, and in terms of the recipient, right? Qatar's decision to fund so much of the Fox broadcasting here in the United States has resulted in an awful lot of propaganda being shoved down people's throats, and that just raises questions. And the broadcast crew, their kind of apolitical stance has really just kind of amplified that all the more. What I've found, and I've had some joint classes with Danyel, and those have been really helpful with American students, listening to and learning from Qatari students. But it seems to me that there hasn't been enough distinguishing of Qatar from the rest of the Arab world. So while there seems to be some kind of pan-Arab pride, especially with the Morocco situation too, that kind of the pan-Islamic notion that seems to be happening. The incidents of the last weekend in terms of Grant Wall's passing, the immediate reaction in the United States was to just lump Qatar in with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and events that occurred there a few years ago. So I'm wondering if maybe there was some miscalculation on Qatar's part in terms of trying to control media in other countries, simply by funding it. Maybe they would have been better off just having the corporate sponsors do what they normally would have. Is that something that any of you have been aware of? But that's certainly been the situation here in the United States for those following the English language coverage.
I have not much to say, but I mentioned that I watched the opening match on German TV, and the hour before the match was mainly on human rights. And then it was funny because 1 minute before the match started, there was a commercial that Emirates, the airline from the UAE, is proudly presenting the World Cup on German TV, on German public TV. And there were also lots of commercials now by Saudi Tourism with Messi, which is also a bit funny. He's playing for PSG and is making, promoting Saudi tourism. So yeah, there seems to be like a lot of golf money being fueled into like media around the world. And I found it a bit like irritating that on German TV, where they were so like critical, that on the other hand, then they take the advertisement money from the golf. But in defense of Fox, I know the discussion in the US is super critical, but they built a huge studio on the Corniche in Doha, and it was open and everybody could walk by and see it. And I just found it brilliant, I mean, in a region with like quite a controlled media environment, this openness, I was just like standing there and, I looked at what's the name of the expert, Donovan and Alexis Lexus and so on. You were standing a couple of meters from them away and there was no walls, no screen, no glass between or something. So I think that was quite a strong statement, you know, for like a certain form of openness of media. I like that, but I know the critical debates and I understand them. Yeah.
Does anyone else like to respond to David's point? Paul or Susan? Paul?
Susan, I don't know if you want to say anything. I'll let you go first if you like.
No, well, the only thing I wanted to say, I mean, I really don't know the background to the Fox thing, so actually I was pleased to hear that from Daniel. But I think also, David, when it comes to media and responses, you know, the media is always so quick to pick up on any statement that anybody makes. And unfortunately for the sportscaster who passed away, it seems his brother had made a statement inadvertent. Well, he made a statement very early on that was accusatory. When you see a statement, then you see on Twitter that he not only rescinded it, he apologized. His wife, Celine Gounder, who is well known, certainly in her field, but because of COVID-19 is on TV here in the United States all the time, was very quick to praise the efforts from the Qatari government and also the US Embassy working in partnership with the Qatari government. So, you know, the initial gut reaction is to point fingers. I think that says a lot more about us in America and how we view this part of the world than the actual reality on the ground. So I think there's really a lot of room for introspection on our part as Americans and how we react to what are a priori notions about a certain part of the world. And hopefully, after seeing the reports by the family, there's a better understanding of exactly how that played out.
So just to add, David's wonderful question, I think it sort of opens up Pandora's box a little bit on soft power as well. So I think the two things I would say on this in terms of, you know, so first of all, from your examples, what we see is that soft power is very, very competitive, and particularly when it's backed by hard power, which certainly in terms of wealth, the Gulf has an abundance of. I'd also argue, though, that I've just had a paper accepted actually on that soft power is actually very unstrategic. We've treated it as a strategic concept, but I've written publications and books on Qatar's soft power strategy. I've never seen a soft power document that Qatar's said, right, this is our document, this is our soft power strategy, this is who it's aimed at, and this is how we're going to achieve it. That's not an attack on Qatar. I don't think soft power works like that. I think a lot of countries just try and control soft power, but it's not really that controllable. It's not really that strategic. I think that's really the key thing there. And I think this is why what you end up seeing is, rather than looking at it and saying, well, you know, Qatar maybe should identify their audience first and then decide a way in which they can gain that soft power without treading on the toes of their neighbors, that would be great, but it doesn't work like that. So I'll have to send the paper around now it's been accepted. But yeah, one argument I think there is you open Pandora's box on, well, is soft power really strategic? Is it really an entity we can strategically control? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, just to give you one really super quick example of that on the Fox broadcast, they right before kickoff on a couple matches, they showed a clip that was called "The Power of the Sword." And it showed a number of Qataris dancing with swords and talked about the tradition of swords and the culture and things like that. And maybe, Daniel, this reflects the openness you saw with the studio crew there, but there was no filter for it in terms of, you know, people waving around weapons and saying, but, you know, well, which Qataris are dancing with the swords? These are the citizens, they aren't the laborers there. Do the laborers get a sword? I mean, how is that supposed to work, right? So it seemed like because Fox is taking the money from Qatar, it was like tourist propaganda in some ways, but without any critical filter whatsoever to just think about how it might be received. So lacking in strategy, Paul, as I guess you'd say.
Thanks, David. I think really kind of really good line of question and kind of good insight into kind of how media discourse is kind of varied across different regions. I wonder whether it's just kind of worth taking a step back and kind of thinking about this kind of differential between different parts of the world. I know, you know, the global north and the global south are kind of big generalizations, but you know, from what Daniel said, that there is kind of stark differences in how the World Cup is being reported. And I wonder whether that is it's not just to do with Qatar itself and the human rights record, but I wonder whether it's to do with the kind of a wider unease about, you know, where liberal democracy stands geopolitically. And I think there's been this idea, at least in a Western European context, that idea of sport for all, and there being, you know, some inextricable link between sport and perhaps particularly football and democracy. And I wonder whether on a subconscious level, people begin to think that link is kind of breaking down, and actually, you know, perhaps reflecting why the geopolitical shifts, the kind of the power is moving away from the kind of traditional established, you know, nations of football to different parts. And, you know, that reflects some of the wider problems of democracy globally, in a kind of a, you know, a kind of a pulling back the frontiers of democracy, a kind of retreat of democracy. Do we think that maybe that's kind of is speculation on my part? It's not perhaps speculation, but I wonder, do we think that there's wider things happening there, to kind of wider narratives around geopolitics that reflect what's going on? And that's to anyone who wants to kind of jump in on that kind of very.
I want to say one thing to this on this issue, although I'm not versed in the same way that Daniel and Paul are, so I would be curious to hear their reactions. The fact is that power and soft power has many different forms. Let me point out the irony of Germany, not Germany as a country, but the press, the media, and their criticisms of Qatar at the same time that Germany, the state, and companies there are signing long-term contracts for LNG from Qatar. Now, when you talk about shoring up of liberal democracies, being able to provide fuel to a country that has been so dependent upon Russia, and enabling that country to take a strong stand with Ukraine against Russia imperial designs on Ukraine, I would say, is another way of looking how you shore up liberal democracy. The same thing with the British press, where Qatar has been supplying LNG to the UK for years and now has increased its supply, and in fact has taken supplies that have historically gone to Asia to divert to Europe to help shore up Europe's determination to stand up to Russia in the face of gas needs. So how do you determine support for liberal democracy? I put that out there because I don't think you can just with one fell swoop say Qatar or any other nation falls into a very tidy category. Thanks.
Yeah, just to echo that, I think with what Susan was saying there, I think, you know, thinking back now to something like Wallerstein's world systems theory, what would that make of the current world in which we live? But I think there's a lot of hypocrisy here. I think in the same way, if you look at these countries like the UK, for example, who have readily critiqued Qatar, they're more than happy to discredit Qatar in terms of symbolic power. But in terms of other forms of power, hard power, economic power, they're more than happy for Qatar to invest and buy up half of London and improve their own economy. So I think there's sort of there's different levels of games going on here, I think. On the one hand, you know, countries like the UK are willing to take money from the Qataris, and I think have certainly no problem with you know, that region of the world being now the center, financial center in many respects. But they just seem to obviously have a hard time, ironically have a hard time, easing off on the sort of more soft power, soft disempowerment, symbolic power terms. So yeah, there's multiple level of games here, I think, going on, and that probably has for a long time now really defined international relations and foreign policy. But yeah, it's a really interesting point. Really interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if the benchmark is just is Qatar, or we will talk about other potential hosts of mega sporting events in the years to come. Is it a democracy? Yes or no? No, it's not a democracy. I mean, there are processes of democratization, like the election of the Shura Council last year, but it's an absolute monarchy. It's an authoritarian country. It's not a democracy. But I think we need a more nuanced analysis than just looking democracy, yes or no. And as Susan and Paul mentioned, Qatar is providing many countries with energy security, amongst them the UK. Germany has not yet gotten energy from Qatar, but we just signed a 15-year contract. And so providing energy security. Qatar is a mediator of international conflicts. And just recently it facilitated the Chad agreement, and it evacuated last year tens of thousands of refugees from Afghanistan. It saved the lives of thousands of people, including people from Germany and the UK. And it's a good global citizen. I mean, they, for example, provide the Gaza people in the Gaza Strip with help. So I think all of this needs to be taken into consideration. And if we just say democracy, yes or no, then Qatar is no democracy and Russia is no democracy. But if we look a little bit more nuanced in it, we will see that Russia is an aggressive state that just invaded Ukraine. And they did so already 4 years before they hosted the World Cup, and when taking a part of the territory of the Ukraine. So I think we then see might have a more positive assessment when we look at Qatar and the features that I and Susan and Paul mentioned. So unfortunately, we cannot, I think, just do mega sporting events in democracies. It won't work because it would exclude too much of the global population. So I think we need to take other factors into account. And overall, I would say Qatar is a good global citizen.
Thank you, Paul, Susan, and Daniel, for your kind of reflections on that point. And I think kind of what listening to all of you has kind of made me realise is that the idea of soft disempowerment is actually much larger, and it actually applies to those states who are trading economically with the likes of Qatar, but criticising it. There's also soft disempowerment for the likes of Germany and the UK, which you've just kind of reflected on. And I suppose there's even a kind of an individual kind of soft disempowerment where we all kind of realise our own complicity and hypocrisy when we choose to criticise a regime, symbolically on sport, but we're much more silent, or we're less interested in kind of the more mundane kind of relations, trade and political relations that country engage with. So I think it's interesting to think that the disempowerment is not just for the host country. I think it extends more kind of broadly than that. So that was kind of really interesting for me to realise. We're kind of bang on 6:30 now. So I'd just like to kind of take the opportunity, first of all, to thank Susan, Paul and Daniel for agreeing to speak this evening. I think it's been a kind of really useful and interesting discussion. And I can see people are making comments kind of in the chat, and thanks to David and Wendy who contributed questions. So I'll draw things to a close. Just a reminder, if people haven't already registered for the annual lecture, it's starting in 30 minutes and it's given by Professor Lauren McAllister. So do join that, and I'm sure that'll be another kind of fascinating discussion. So thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed it, and please keep an eye out for other events, including our conference that we're holding, the Political Studies Sport and Politics group of the PSA next year. Thanks everyone.